chose organized crime for my topic for my presentation in International Business Law 432. I work for a law enforcement agency, so that's why I chose organized crime. I actually, in the arrests that are made through my law enforcement agency, I see ties to organized crime every day through the drugs and violence and murders. And I actually live in a small town, so it really surprised me when I started to see the ties. I'm going to talk about who, what, where, and why. So first I'll talk about why. Money equals power. Money equals influence. It's the basis of everything we do, even as citizens who make our money legally. We use money every day to buy everything, and so it basically runs our societies. They gain money illegally. Their actual definition is a large group of individuals who gain money and power through illegal means, and that's from the National Department of Justice. So they don't actually say how many individuals equals a large group of individuals, but they do have measures on the exact illegal means. Most of them use multiple illegal means, which brings me to what they do. Make him an offer he can't refuse, from The Godfather, is a quote that is very popular and can be said to come from the actual organized crimes like the mafias and stuff that we saw in America at that time. So they use money, of course, to buy off people. That's where their political ties come through. They will also buy off judges, policemen, to help them do their illegal stuff so that they don't get caught or they never go to jail or prosecution is hard. They use intimidation and violence. They rob places to take, like jewelry or entertainment systems, a lot of technologies, computers, iPads, anything they can get their hands on, and then they will sell it at a lower price somewhere else. They also counterfeit money and spread that through the U.S., which is handled by the U.S. Treasury. They do loan sharking, which is it's what the older gangs used to do. You don't really see it much anymore, but that's where they would give somebody a loan and then beat them up if they didn't pay it back in a term that they came to whenever they wanted. We see it in gambling. Gambling is, of course, controlled by the government, and so we'll see them gamble outside the government so they can evade taxes. They also use violence in gambling. If they can't pay off their debts quick enough, then they will hurt them and or murder them. Murder is sometimes handled through contracts. They hire individuals, not necessarily part of their gang, but who are hitmen, and they will hire them to murder someone to get their point across. Human trafficking is seen in every country where they will take people and enslave them. Usually it's through prostitution, but we also see it in everyday things, like being nannies or farm workers, things like that. Fraud is a huge thing. I'm sure you guys have gotten a call, or maybe you haven't, but what I see a lot is people will get a call and it'll say that the IRS is investigating them and their taxes, and that there's a warrant out for their arrest, and if they pay them $3,000, the warrant will go away. That's a huge fraud that goes on, and it's as technology is advancing, so is organized crime. Guns is also huge in trade. Guns is a commodity, though, that they usually keep. So, like, if they sell them a rifle, they always have that rifle. It's not something that they run out of quickly or use it once and it's done. But arming citizens who are already rebelling against law is not the best for society. So that's a huge factor. Drugs is their number one. It's their number one breadwinner, whether it be heroin or cocaine or marijuana or methamphetamine. All of those things are being brought across across the countries and across the world into other countries and being sold, and that's their #1 breadwinner. So that one is probably the most prominent and the one that you'll see the most. So we're going to look at popular organizations that are in many countries. Usually organizations stay within their races or where they're from. So #1 is the Russian Mafia. They actually have over 200 groups in 60 countries. The group listed on the screen is the most successful in bringing in $8.5 billion, which is a lot of money. Their main trade is heroin, which they get from Afghanistan. They also are involved in racketeering, fraud, gambling, and murder. It's actually interesting that their main breadwinner is heroin. In Russia, Russia actually consumes 12% of the heroin trade in all of the world, and Russia only has 0.5% of the population. So heroin is a huge problem in Russia. The Italian mafias, they actually bring in $33 billion between the 4 groups. The #1 group is the Camorra, which brings in $4.9 billion. They are involved in firearms, arson, bombing, loan sharking, gambling, fraud, political corruption, and counterfeit money. The next one, the 'Ndrangheta, brings in $4.5 billion. The Italians are known for being Robin Hoods. They actually have great public relations with the poor by giving back to their communities. So they make themselves good, and it's really hard for prosecution to indict them when the community thinks of them as good. Of course, we know that the public has a huge say in cases. And so, but the Camorra actually still has ties to La Cosa Nostra, which La Cosa Nostra was an American Italian mafia, with the families being Bonanno and Gambino. They were in the news a lot in the 70s and 80s. They owned some of the casinos in Las Vegas. They were in Chicago and Philly and New York. A lot of your famous murders. John Getty is a huge case. He got a life sentence in New York for murder, but those were huge in the United States, but they also have ties to actual Italy. The Japanese, they are known as the Yamaguchi Gumi. They bring in $6.6 billion. They are involved in drug trafficking, gambling, and extortion. Their main drug of choice is meth, which they make domestically, and then they sell it across the streets. They are also widely known through Japan as the Yakuza, which is the Japan version of mafia, but they also own bus routes and trade routes and roads, which they make you pay tolls on to travel on them. So that's where they get a lot of their money, through extortion. Finally, in Mexico, we have the Sinaloa cartel, which brings in $3 billion. That is the largest cartel in Mexico, and they are the ones that you will see in the news the most often for killing political officials and different other cartels. Their main breadwinners are, of course, marijuana and cocaine, which they bring into the United States and Canada. So they have a lot of American ties, and they have their little subgroup cartels like MS-13. So the reason they're called organized crime is because they have a structure. They are organized in their dealings, not just how they do crime and how they hide it, but also their overall structure of people. So their structures are a lot like on the screen, but this is just, it's kind of a mixture of how they do it. You'll see a lot of them, especially the cartels, they have military structures. So they have their lieutenants, their captains, their sergeants, and then their soldiers. In the Italian cartels, you see their captains, their lieutenants, their sergeants, and their associates. That's what they're called, as associates, is the footmen, the go-getters, the errand runners. Depending on your job and how much money you make them is depending on your rank. So the more money you bring in, the more chance you get to go up in the ranks. The only problem with being promoted is you usually make someone jealous inside your organization, and you will see murder inside the organization, by the organization, and so that they can move up the rank. It's a very vicious cycle. These guys, of course, aren't known for their kindness and their ability to deal with society in a mature way, but they are very violent and they will kill each other just for rank. But it's also they protect their leaders very well, not only from law enforcement, but from other illegal organizations, because if the other illegal organizations find out, they will also kill their leaders to mess up their structure and try to take over. So it's very cutthroat. In the U.S., law enforcement agencies are working hard on strategies to bring them down. The U.S. Department of Justice actually released reports. They constantly release a report, but they released one in 2008 on a new strategy to bring down organized crime. Number one is information and intelligence. So this is where you see your undercover operations, where they send people in to get information. Especially contacts are very important in order to find out who is who and how they're dealing and stuff like that. But the more information and intelligence that you get on the operations, the better you are able set up to bring them down. Also sharing that information and collaboration across jurisdictions, as well as the FBI and CIA, which of course have jurisdiction over all of the United States, are being used to bring these guys down. Finally, they prioritize when they bring people down, so they kind of use the same technique as the other organizations. If you bring the top person down, then you can disseminate the whole entire structure. So they will go after the bosses and the lieutenants and the higher leaders to bring down the entire organization as a whole faster, hopefully, than they can rebuild. So they attack from all angles. So they cut off all means of money. They go after the drug, the human trafficking, the prostitution, the gambling. They go after all of that at once to cut them off from their money so that they can't run away. They can't get away. They can't bring money to get away. And of course, as an enterprise, their theory is if you go through all of these systems and all of these steps and you bring them down, you bring down the entire organization and you just dismantle it by creating chaos within it, because if you bring down the higher ups, then people are fighting on who should be promoted next and stuff, and you slowly start to disseminate all of them and you bring down all of the criminals. We saw this with the La Costa Nostras in the 1990s. They actually brought that entire organization down. They completely destroyed it. You don't really see them anymore by the conviction of John Gotti and the life sentence. But they did a really good job using bugs in the vehicles to gain intelligence, and also an undercover FBI agent. Since organized crimes, they reach across countries, like I said, of course the United Nations is involved. The United Nations also puts out reports based on intelligence that it receives to all of its member states, and gives them suggestions and policies to follow and implement into their laws to help stop the organized crimes. They actually do a crime threat assessment, which tells them where the criminals are getting all of their resources and like what that means. So if they're getting guns from West Africa, that means that you're giving criminals guns and rebellions guns, and that gives them the means to cause chaos in your society. So it gives you the reasons why the threat is important and what you need to do about it. As you can see on the map here, this is the drug trade. Like I said, drug is their bread and butter. Drugs are the most popular thing that they have to make money. And so I got this from one of the United Nations reports, and it shows how, medicines are traded from Asia to Africa. Heroin is brought up from Southeast Asia up to Russia. And you also have the smuggling of immigrants and you have the smuggling of migrants from Latin America to America, and also from Africa to Europe. So you have all of these things going on that are causing these issues. But this is a really good map just to show you how connected they are and how many countries they influence. It's the entire world. I want to thank you so much for your time. And these are my resources. I actually watched Netflix Organized Crime, The American Mafia. It was really good if you're interested. It has a lot of good information about what they did in the 70s, 80s, 90s to bring down the La Cosa Nostra. That's where I got a lot of my information. Also, the National Department of Justice and the United Nations Department of Drugs and Crime. I also used my 2 peer-reviewed. Those, I really like the peer-reviewed articles. I think they're excellent sources and excellent papers to read. Again, thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.